Hello, in this video I want to continue the conversation that we've been having about Afro-Pessimism and space privatization. I think that this is a really interesting critique for this resolution, not just because Afro-Pessimism is a critique that shows up like on almost any resolution, but particularly because I think that it allows for a particular relationship to understanding like the idea of how the resolution is written in such a way that kind of like allows for a lot of arguments about negativity, a lot of arguments about refusal, and places where you don't really have to do something generative, but rather disagree with kind of like the resolutional question being something that's unjust. And I think that there are a lot of really important facets for how Afro-Pessimism deals with a lot of the affirmatives that have kind of become meta in relationship to that. And so in this video, I kind of want to start talking about Afro-Pessimism as a negative strategy versus policy teams, do a little bit in terms of just thinking about like what are some of the core priorities that you should have against policy teams when you're reading Afro-Pessimism in this context, what you should be trying to accomplish, and then how those kind of concerns transfer over into like how you should be generally framing the debate and the thesis portions of the debate. I think that being able to kind of have a full grasp on these central kind of like meta portion of the debate are super important, because there'll be the central kind of like framing or top level arguments that will set up like what is the kind of like arguments that you'll make later on in the flow. And I think that in order for the judge to kind of have an understanding of how they should be evaluating your arguments and kind of like through what epistemological frame you want the debate to really operate, then you really need to get a grasp on how you kind of use these flows. And I think that they're more convincing the more that you can create a nuanced explanation of them in the context of space. And so hopefully this video is able to really like help you kind of like understand like ways to do that in subtle ways, and what are kind of like the ways in order for you to kind of like execute the strategy better overall, the things that you should be looking out for if you're looking to find ways to answer or defend against this strategy. I think that just generally when I'm thinking about like what are some of the priorities or things that I would be thinking about in terms of like space privatization and Afro-Pessimism, is that I definitely think there's so much to talk about in terms of like how teams are thinking about the resolution. There's this kind of like debate that's happening around like the LD world already about like kind of the extra T nature of a lot of affirmatives on the resolution, where the resolution itself only asks for people to kind of like say that the privatization of space is unjust, but people are also kind of like finding ways to read policy affirmatives that do other space projects or ban space privatization in order to create public space programs in other contexts that are like necessary for allowing certain countries to have access to space or changing the field of international relations as a whole. And I think that there's a kind of like way in which you can kind of like use this kind of like call to extra topicality as a way for you to kind of like make arguments about like why there's a particular relationship to the fiat or the idea of how we're able to think about futurity in debate and its relationship to like what we think is productive conversation or debate as a whole, that the response to the resolution that requires us to create something generative in order to think about the continuation of humanity, or the idea of being able to create a sustainable world that's able to respond to the concerns that come with space, even if we're able to say no to space privatization as a whole, is a really interesting place for you to make a lot of arguments about like why the particular relationship that the affirmative is taking towards space is one that kind of like it is like necessitated or only even justified by like the relationship that the affirmative has to core optimism. I think that even outside like the terms of like the status kind of rhetoric of those affirmatives, the idea that there's just kind of like this necessity that even if we ban space privatization, there's still a demand of what we do with space so that humanity can survive, says a lot about the way in which like humanity as itself has secured itself within civil society so much that there is no way to imagine a world where the world is ending or where humanity like ceases to exist. And I feel like there are so many arguments to be made in terms of Afro-Pessimism about why that particular framing is a necessary like way to think about like building other grammars of suffering or different ways to relate to this, how we should understand the question of vitality. I think there are so many good arguments to make about like how space operates as a way to think about like human vitality as it relates to the extension of science and technology into the future, and the way in which the kind of like hegemony or the ability to kind of like harness the power of technology and science is necessary in order to create this world in which we understand humanity as like this continual existence and like ontologize it as something that's supposed to last forever. And I think a lot of the stuff that you can start doing when you start looking at like ways that you can frame the debate and find these concerns for the debate is by thinking about like why this particular relationship to vitality or the survival of human existence is one that only allows for the continued denial of like those that are already sacrificed in the name of humanity, and ultimately continues like the route of being able to justify the worst causes in order to continue civil society at all costs, which is literally like how slavery is able to be kind of like reinscribed into the logic of not just policy making, but the relationship that we have to like what we think about like the purpose of humanity or these kind of like moral obligations are in the first place, all of which I think are really interesting considerations to make. I then think that when you're trying to consider like what this means in terms of the framing portion of the debate, I think that making arguments about futurism and making arguments about like white futurism and the idea of like human vitality as central to like policy and organizing and critiquing that lens is like super important for you to make arguments that kind of decentralize monopolize the type of like impact comparison notions that judges really want to take up in order to like vote affirmative in a lot of these cases. I think that's shifting the paradigm to be something to be a question of just like how should we kind of like be able to critique the field of ethics and way in which we understand what it means to live life ethically, even if that means our ability to sacrifice human life because of the way in which like that human life only exists because of like immorality in relationship to slavery, etc. And being able to extend that framing in terms of like why that kind of like vitality is in a framework, like in terms of like the academy and debate often operate through its ability to kind of like monopolize institutions and take up in such a space in such a way that makes it impossible for us to think about alternatives to like what human life really looks like. I didn't think that when you transition into the thesis value, a lot of the criticisms that you need to be making are about like why the ascension into like science and technology as like places to show like human development are only crafted in their relationship to like the original progress that is kickstarted by slavery, that there's so many patents, works, and arguments to be made about like how programs like NASA and others couldn't even exist without like the unrecognized labor of Black people broadly, and why this particular relationship to how we kind of like consider like the value of that labor can never be something that's like reconstructed through our ability to reinvest into Black bodies now, but rather it's something that we have to sit with in terms of how science and technology are not only like us, like, you know, biological or scientific processes that kind of like ensure our ability for survival, but also how they're kind of like cultural and political processes that create particular like symbolic relationships about like who has access or is good enough to be able to harness or have a hegemony over like private over space over science and technology in the first place, and why the kind of like endowment of such a power ultimately represents a particular perfection of white humanity that only allows it to secure itself as something that is like necessary in order for continued development, ideas of progress, and the ability to kind of like dictate things like spatialization. And I think that being able to kind of like impress on like why those kind of like central like themes in the context of space privatization make Afro-Pessimism particularly like important and relevant are ways that you can already start kind of pushing to the judge that the framing that you're making is not just about like why the world and humanity is bad broadly, but why in the context of the specific generative thing that the affirmative is doing in the context of the resolution produces a particular relationship to anti-Black violence that ontologizes it as a system. And I think that that is the best way for you to kind of like start contextualizing what will make more sense on the link debate, the permutation debate, impact comparison, alternative debating, which we'll talk about in the next video. So hopefully you'll tune in, and thank you as always for watching this one.